sábado a todos os presentes, a todos que nos acompanham aqui na divulgação online. Neste momento, eu tenho a segunda-feira da mesa do Colóquio, e eu convido a pessoa, o Moderador da Mesa, a doutora Geoffrey. É doutora em Direito pela Universidade Federal da Catarina, e doutorado em Sustentabilidade da Universidade. É mestre em Direito na área de Direito e Relações Internacionais da Universidade Federal da Catarina e é membro do Grupo de Estudos Avançados de Meio Ambiente e Economia do Direito Internacional. Convido a compor também a lista do professor Geoffrey da Universidade da coordena a pesquisa de Direito e Governança para o Programa de Liderança pela tendo atuação ativa nas pesquisas dos movimentos internacionais voltados à defesa. Seu ponto de pesquisa é o Direito Ecológico. O professor é membro do Comitê Diretor de Legislação de Direito Ecológico e Ecológico. Convido também a doutora Mesa, a professora Internacional, da UC A professora é doutora em Direito pela Universidade de Brasília, é professora análise da Unidade Intelectual da Universidade de São Francisco, na Pharmaceutical, onde ela é fundadora e diretora acadêmica do Convido a compor a mesa também a professora Catarina, a não conhecida da Universidade do Colóquio, que nos acompanha. A professora é doutora em Direito pela Universidade, é também advogada, fundadora e diretora executiva do Centro de Direito Musical e membro do Comitê Diretor da Associação de Direito Ecológico e Governança. É também vice-presidente do Grupo de Especialistas em Direito Digital da Comissão Mundial. Para darmos início à mesa, passo a palavra então ao moderador do Cavendish.
Boa tarde a todos. É um prazer estar de volta. Para dar início à nossa mesa, vou passar a palavra ao professor Geoffrey, que vai referir a palestra Pandemias e Monoculturas. Não está funcionando?
Boa tarde a todos. Estou muito feliz de estar aqui na UFSC com meus amigos da França e também daqui. Vou fazer minha palestra em inglês. I'm going to switch now off this sound for interpretation. I'll be working through the Zoom. Everybody, can you hear me online? If they can tell you, I can't see the chat, but I think we have everything ready. So, yes, I want to thank you, Mai, and everybody at UFSC, the students, the coordination, the sponsors for hosting this event. So, I'm going to talk about pandemics and monocultures. I've been discussing with Professor Dharani for a couple of years now this idea of looking at monocultures as a fundamental problem that are linked to pandemics, among other things. So, when we talk about monocultures,
we're really talking about not just material monocultures that maybe we're used to thinking, monocultures of crop production, of industrialization, but it was actually here at Florianopolis when I came in November 2019, so around the time of U.S. Thanksgiving, I went to downtown Florianopolis, and everywhere I saw signs for Black Friday. And it was that event really that made me, that crystallized in my mind that we really need to be thinking about conceptual monocultures. And so I can see, I think, how they interact, both these material and conceptual monocultures that create problems, including pandemics, that are creating crises now. So material monocultures would be uniform, single-purpose organizations or manipulations of a material or energetic process. So an example would be a single crop, agriculture, or industrial production, and I'll give a detailed example. And then these conceptual or ideological monocultures are when we have universal worldviews, paradigms, ideologies, epistemologies, ontologies, cosmologies, ways of thinking that are put forth as absolute and unquestionable and or as superior to or dominant over or exclusive of all others. So examples of this would be growth and systems economics. Look at Sustainable Development Goal 8. Sustainable development has become sustained economic growth as a keystone of those goals. Or state-centered legal systems.
We might think of
that also as a kind of monoculture.
Here are just a broad
sweep of the kinds of things where we might see monoculture. So the production, but also a value, where money and monetary value is a default monoculture value. Law, we have state-centered law, as I said. Social culture, there's this idea of McDonaldization. You can go down a miracle mile, as we call them in the United States and Canada, and every store is the same in every city. You could be anywhere. Of language. We have these dominant languages in the world. Mandarin, Spanish, English, for example. Of knowledge, Western science, as opposed to many other forms of knowledge, including traditional or local knowledge. Of education, or educational systems, at least in Western societies, tend to be organized around isolated disciplines that we have to force to communicate together if we want to look at them either interdisciplinary, multi-disciplines, or transversally.
Of happiness.
So this is Black Friday. Buy, you will be happy. Go to Disney World, you will be happy. Advertising is all about making you think you need things to be happy. Of people. In many of these ideological systems, people are considered homo economicus. We all want to be as rich as possible. We want as much stuff as we can possibly get. We are seen as consumers. We even force fit corporations into this idea of personhood that is maybe the epitome of this model of homo economicus. And spirituality. Think of the monotheistic religions, for example. So, some common features of monocultures. Well, in my studies, I learned when I did my PhD, took a deep dive into system science, from a systems point, with monocultures, you have kind of an engineering approach to systems control, and I'll explain this in a minute. Where the goals are uniformity, predictability, scalability, tight control. There are also links of monocultures to the idea of colonization, which I aligned with material monocultures, and colonialism. So with colonization, I like this definition from Maria Fischer-Kowalski and Helmut Haberl from the Institute of Social Ecology, talking about the complex of social activities that deliberately change important parameters of natural systems and actively maintain them in a state different from the conditions that would prevail in the absence of human intervention. They're talking about the Neolithic transition to agriculture, which is one form of colonization. At the extreme, we have big monocultures that fit this definition. And then colonialism, which I put together a bunch of definitions to call the uninvited settlement of occupied lands with forced imposition of settler worldviews and lifeways on a diverse array of indigenous peoples and life communities. So life communities meaning not just humans. So when we talk about monocultures versus more diverse systems from a systems point of view, again, with monocultures we're really talking about a kind of engineering resilience. And so the goal of monoculture systems is to have a very narrow range of structure and function. You're seeking uniformity and consistency with the results. Think about producing a product at the end of an assembly line. Predictability, you don't want surprises. You want to return to one stable state, which is the end goal of this single thing that you're managing the system around. Efficiency tends to be important, especially when it's combined with economic systems. These are systems that resist evolution. You're trying to stop evolution to keep it in this one state. Whereas with diverse ecological systems, with ecological resilience, you're accepting a broad range of structure and function. There's a lot of flexibility to have the thriving ecological system exist and move forward in time. Unpredictability is not a problem. You adapt to that. You accept diverse possibilities and arrangements within the system. The goal is persistence over time, taking advantage of the system's ability to self-organize as conditions change. So these are systems that are evolutionary and embrace evolution. Let's take a look at a particular kind of monoculture, industrial hog farming. And this article, to me, was so eye-opening. It was one of these sort of cathartic articles that explained how this kind of a monoculture works. So one of the things that was fascinating to me about this is that artificial insemination only became necessary in hog farming fairly recently compared to how it was used, say, in cattle farming. And it was done in order to protect the sows from getting sick from the hogs. You didn't want to have that trajectory of disease. In 1997, 7% of U.S. hog farms used artificial insemination. By 2006, it was 90%. You also have within this monoculture a huge concentration of the industry within a small number of farms. So from 1979, we went from 650,000 hog farms in the United States, producing 15 million pounds. In 2004 to 70,000. So a drastic reduction in the number, but a huge increase in the size. And now they're producing 21 million pounds, million pounds. These are all million pounds. Sorry about the figures. And then in 20 total production, 28 million pounds. And this is the story of this, how this works. So this is from the USDA's Sector at a Glance webpage. Large operations that specialize in a single phase of production, which is the meat growing, have replaced farrow to finish operations that performed all phases of production. These are kind of smaller farms that go from raising the piglets all the way up and preparing the sows to become mothers and so on. That's now chopped into pieces. The use of production contracts has increased. This is something that is also becoming increasingly common in Brazil. Structural changes have coincided with efficiency gains and lower production costs. These are what these systems are engineered around, efficiency gains and lower costs. Most of the productivity gains are attributable to increases in the scale of production and technological innovation. So these are the parameters that are controlled. You can see this has allowed huge increases in the export of hog products, of pork from the United States. This is an industry that has. So in this article, they note that actually Henry Ford learned from how pig farming was done to embrace mechanization, but in turn, the hog industry is now learning about vertical integration of their production. So everything from the marketing to the production of food for the hogs is all combined now in a vertically integrated economic system. What's the end goal? Well, so again, you want uniformity and consistency. You want consumers to know what they're getting when they go to the market and buy your pork. So consistent, uniform meat quality at a large scale, increasing scale, as you saw. One thing they have to manage in order to achieve this is the stress of animals. So they've hired an animal psychologist and others to figure out how you reduce stress of the hogs when they're being slaughtered. You narrow the number of breeds that you're using to produce this meat. In fact, almost all of this meat is one single breed of pork. And the breed you want it has to be lean, not too much fat, fast conversion of feed to protein. That's efficiency and productivity in this system. Overbreeding and loss of genetic diversity then becomes something you have to control over time. What you end up is what's called commodity pork. Cheap, but mediocre. But when then people get used to it. This is the American meat market. And you can see in this system when you try to maintain that goal of a certain quality of meat at scale, you have all these things to worry about: disease, overbreeding, and so those are all of the things that you're engineering to take care of to keep the end result the same. Introducing new technologies and so on. So this article went on as breeders have pushed for efficiency. They've also relaxed the standards for physical traits that allow pigs to stand on concrete their whole lives without going lame. Hogs can live up to 20 years in the wild, but large pork producers usually cull sows after less than 4 years. So hog geneticists work to develop sows, quote, with the fortitude to withstand the rigors of confinement. So again, the breeding, in order to get that end result, here's another challenge that you constantly have to tweak along the way to make that system work. I was fascinated by this. This is an invention in the pork industry that allows hogs that die within these huge farms to be quickly removed. Another picture of what it takes to keep that engineered system towards meeting its goal. In just a little more than a decade, the modern hog industry has produced a tower of efficiency maximizing products, one stacked atop the next, each innovation fixing the problem the last created, so it's this race against time as well. It is a monumental, somewhat haphazard structure composed of slatted floors and aluminum crates, automatic sorting scales, and mechanized wet and dry feeders. It is constructed of gene packer sows, so these are now genetically bred cows that have this copyrighted name, I'm sure. Thailand antibiotic feed. You have to constantly adjust the antibiotics and drugs that you use to fend off disease. AgroClean liquid detergent, Argus salmonella vaccine, golden pig bone tip disposable AL catheter, CL sow replacer milk substitute, and matrix estrate synchronizer. That's your pork chop in the United States, right there. So what do we have? A classic example of a monoculture. And one that becomes very vulnerable, as you see, and you constantly have to chase to keep the system working as you want it. So let's just review quickly how this works. Hogs are seen as a source of profit, not as intelligent living beings. There's a narrow range of hog breeds in order to keep this fix on the result that you want. Limited number of parent companies, so combined with a monocultural economic system, you get concentration in the industry, loss of individuality of hog farms and farmers. So instead of having small farms, if you want to raise hogs, you're probably going to have to get linked to these big producers under a contract. As I said, I talked to some people, one student in my class 2 years ago was working on a farm community in Rio Grande do Sul, and her family was a contractor chicken farm, and so she was telling me how this system works very similarly with poultry. Uniformity in vertically integrated production models. The feedstuffs are also monocultures. So think corn, for example, or other things porks are going to eat. People are seeing monoculture as pork consumers. The industry looks at people mostly as people that they're going to buy the product. So it's interdependent with monocultural economic systems and the monocultural legal systems that support them. What's the legal and policy infrastructure for the industrial hog farming in the U.S.? Well, there are weak antitrust regimes that allow the concentration, so enterprise monocultures, I guess. Absence or limited impact of animal cruelty laws, meat-friendly, healthy food diagrams. So in the United States, there's always a battle when the USDA adjusts its food diagram. How many vegetables, how much fruit? Well, the meat industry is always pushing to get meat more present there. Industry-friendly trade and investment laws and policy. Weak environmental laws, for example, on concentrated animal feed lot operations. Industry-friendly land use laws. So converting land, putting in a hog farm, and just imagine the waste that a hog or a cow or another industrially produced animal is producing concentrated. That these are kind of like cities without sewage systems in many places. Ag-gag laws, I'll explain what that is in a minute. And lots and lots of subsidies to make this work. I'm not going to go to this. Well, I'll just show you quickly this. It's going to be too complicated with the Zoom here. But if you go to the USDA's, the website was earlier, you just look how the USDA presents this industry, and the essence of the monoculture comes through very clearly. So what does this have to do with pandemics? I remember hearing this, and I confirmed it again yesterday. The 2009 swine flu, the H1N1 pandemic that we heard about earlier today. The first victim, known victim, according to this article, was a boy living near a huge Smithfield Foods industrial hog farm in Veracruz, Mexico. And of course, the hog industry denies that they had anything to do with it. But the logic and the sense of this makes sense, that there was a link. Intensive farming systems make industrial poultry and swine operations into breeding grounds for a host of perilous diseases. And as we know, this is then what pandemics can jump from. In Southeast Asia, where most bird flu outbreaks have occurred, poultry production has increased 8-fold over the past 3 decades. So you can have similar kinds of monocultural systems with other meat production. Movement of industrial farm workers and animals exacerbates the threat. So we saw earlier today that we have to include things like ICAO, the Civil Aviation Organization and World Trade Organization, in the conversation about the link between these monocultures and pandemics. Meatpacking factories were a notable source of COVID-19 outbreaks around the world. You have concentrated animals and then people concentrated in the part of the process where the meat is being packaged for selling. And that disease control requires antibiotics, pesticides. Number one, sometimes they're not going to work, which increases the risk of outbreaks. But you also have this race against time. Antibiotic resistance develops in animals and then with humans as well. And then we have this vicious cycle of the more these monocultures grow, the more we need these antibiotics and pesticides, which then have additional effects on diversity of environment of ecosystems. Crop monocultures also create risks. So what we're focusing maybe mostly on pandemics among humans, but there are of course many pandemics among animals and plants, especially ones that are grown in these monocultures. So plant disease pandemics are more likely with crop monocultures. I read when I was looking at this that about a third of the rice crop globally is lost to disease, fungus, and so on, and 10 to 25% of corn and wheat.
So
plant disease epidemics are more likely with crop monocultures, depleted soils, and climate change exacerbate these risks.
And then
that in turn creates problems with food security for humans. They become more vulnerable as these crop monocultures become more vulnerable to plant pandemics. Global trade also again exacerbates the risk of plant pandemics because you have people and these plants moving around the globe. Another aspect of these monocultures is that habitat destruction to create monocultures removes buffers against wildlife pathogens reaching human communities. So this is probably still the leading contender for how COVID-19 entered human communities. Some examples of crop diseases that have proved near disasters are soybean rust, kind of fungus that affects soybeans that spread very, very quickly, faster than it could be controlled. And then Cavendish Bananas, the one single breed of bananas that are most commonly sold in North America, for example, or in Europe. There was a crisis because they were at risk of a disease. That there was a race to control.
So what's the response?
So what's the response going to be? Are we going to find new forms of disease detection technologies and more powerful fungicides?
I thought this was
really interesting. Popular science. So science on the street says that's what we have to do.
But that's kind of
a band-aid solution. The alternative, which is more complicated, which I think we're talking about here when we talk about new approaches to dealing with pandemics, or at least that we should be, is about transforming our food systems when we talk about these kind of monocultures.
So
that's really a summary of the links. I want to also contextualize this a little bit more in the work that I'm doing with Professor Darani, with Katie Guiestan, who we'll hear about a little later, and others through the Ecological Law and Governance Association. So we developed a statement during the COVID crisis on what should we learn from this lesson, and it was called From Tragedy to Transformation. So we joined the many voices insisting that the recovery from this shared global experience must not be returned to the pre-COVID status quo. And I think this is the motivation for having a convention, that is preparing us in better ways and in different ways to look at the interlinked systems that are involved in pandemics, human, animals, and the environment. Our recommendations, and I think these are relevant. I hope these can be considered in sort of a fundamental way as any convention is being looked at. Learn the right lessons about the interconnectedness of all life. Strengthen commitments to living within global ecological limits, including ones related to biodiversity. Taking an ecological approach to what we define as essential. One principle that I think is important in ecological law is that we have to shift more towards more and more and more, and being efficient to having enough and being sufficient in meeting human needs, so that we are encouraging diversity in the rest of the community of life that humans are part of. Focus on protecting the most vulnerable people and other living beings. It's just astonishing how rarely that approach is taken, but it makes so much sense. Let's focus on the most vulnerable first. Resist environmental backsliding and look to alternative economic models. It's fun to say that phrase when I'm here with Michel Prieur, with whom I work so closely in developing the principe de non-régression. It's very important that we move forward, understand and address the ethical issues, and we'll hear more from Katie Guiestan about that. I invite you to look at our statement here. Another way to think about this is to consider the misalignment of law and morality, and the way I test this out is how we would categorize some existing laws if we had a foundation of morality that was focused on having a mutually enhancing human-Earth relationship, and not our goals of infinite economic growth on a finite planet. Well, some things would be legal and moral, like recycling. Some things would still be illegal and immoral, like killing endangered species, at least in many parts of the world. But then you have these two problem categories. Things that are legal
immoral.
So what would be
industrial agriculture.
agriculture?
How can we think of that as a moral system? If our goal as a global society was to have a mutually enhancing human relationship. Coal ash disposal in the United States is just an example, and we could think of many others where an industry was able to get a major exemption from environmental rules because the coal industry is so powerful. So they can dispose their coal ash as regular solid waste, not as hazardous waste. And there have been some horrible accidents affecting aquatic systems and so on.
Illegal and
immoral. This is interesting. Using genetically modified organisms that are contaminated
by your
neighbor.
And then the
wind drift comes and your seeds get contaminated. In Canada, Monsanto has won suits against those people who involuntarily had their crops contaminated, and they lost patent lawsuits because of that. Illegal, but considered but moral, and if your goal is a mutually enhancing human relationship. These are ag gag laws in many farming states, big farming states, Indiana, for example. If you go into an animal industrial farm, take pictures, and tell the world about it, you are the one that can be prosecuted. Not the farm that is treating those animals so cruelly. So that's how powerful the lobby is to keep exist they are. And then in the very, very broad picture, we can align the problem of monocultures and monocultural ways of thinking with all of these other features of the conceptual or ideological systems that I would suggest we need to propose. We need to move away from anthropocentricity, colonialism. You can read the list here. A big part of this, though, is instead of thinking there's only one right way of doing things, embracing diversity, cultural diversity, legal diversity, including the legal traditions of indigenous and local people, and there's plenty of examples. That would be another lecture that I'd be happy to give, but it's not for today. Hubris versus humility. I think that's a really, really important one here. And I just want to end with this: that ecological law has a lot to offer, and my friend and colleague Carlos Spert breaks ecological law down to these three principles, which again I hope we can keep front and center as we're talking about a new convention that's trying to deal with the risks of pandemics in the future. Ecocentrism, recognizing and respecting the value of all beings and the interconnectedness among them, equitably promoting the interests of human and non-human members of the Earth community. Ecological primacy, ensuring that social and economic behavior and systems are ecologically bound, respecting, for example, planetary boundaries. And ecological justice, ensuring equitable access to the Earth's sustaining capacity for present and future generations of humans and other beings, and avoiding the inequitable allocation of environmental harms. Those are broad principles, but I think they're very relevant to a discussion around pandemics and how monocultures are a part of the crisis that we need to address going forward in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Geoffrey. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Geoffrey, for your speech. And I would like to invite Professor Dana now to just get a note of your speech. Seria convidar a professora Catarina para falar agora sobre, a palestra será sobre pandemias e propriedade intelectual. Passa a palavra para a professora Dana. Thank you.
So in the meantime, I want to, number one, thanks Jeff for this really very interesting presentation. Love your slides. I would like to thank everyone here for being here, and those of you who are virtually here, thanks for being here. And in particular, I want to thank Professor Kirani. She's not in the room right now, but for the excellent job of organizing this and of inviting me to speak at this super interesting conference. So I've already had very interesting conversations with participants and speakers. So I hope I'm the host now, so that will allow me to one moment, please. All right. Okay, thank you very much for the technical support. So now that hopefully we're nearing the end of the COVID pandemic, although I know there are some people who disagree, but we do all hope that we will be through it. We can ask the question, was the world prepared for the COVID-19 pandemic? And generally, most people would answer that we were not really prepared, either not prepared at all or not really well. So I'm going to speak about the hurdles in terms of access, in particular access to medicines, access to vaccines. And there are, in terms of vaccines, there are, in terms of, so here we see the pathway from a sample, virus sample that comes from a source country, could be in this COVID situation with China, goes to the WHO or its collection centers worldwide, and then it gets distributed to various recipients, maybe universities, maybe pharma companies, and so on. So that part is relatively under control. We had a speech earlier by Professor de Putter, and she described how this access to samples occurs in the influenza situations through a pandemic influenza preparedness framework. So from the recipient will conduct R&D, and once the R&D is completed and the drug is developed, they will file for patent protection. Based on this patent protection, the drug is commercialized. Now this is really a skeleton outline because there are many more steps, but this will illustrate what I'm going to try and say. This is the pandemic influenza preparedness that Professor Putter spoke about. It did not trigger COVID because of the definition it had, but certainly it's on the way of solving the issue of access to the samples. Now, let's go to access to medicines, and that is governed by private national law. And in particular, intellectual property law, in particular patents, and they may have the effect of limiting access to medicines, in particular to lower countries because of the current cost of medicines. So we don't really have a good solution for the right part. That's why it is in red, and especially relating to lower income countries. This was signaled with great vigor in October 2020. October 2020, South Africa and India filed a request for a waiver of patent rights with the World Trade Organization. And those rights obviously were connected with the COVID pandemic, is the text of the requests. So they asked for the rights to be waived in relation to prevention, containment, or treatment of COVID. So at this point, it had become clear that the distribution of vaccines would be less than equitable. And India and South Africa, supported by 57 other countries, filed this request. Now, this request was quite remarkable in two ways. Once, it had never happened before in this manner, and so it points out to the proactiveness and preparedness of these 57 countries who were thinking ahead in October 2020. But the other reason is the lineup of the countries. And normally in these types of requests, lineup of the countries, global north versus global south. Global north request is against the waiver and global south is for the waiver. Well, in this case, the Biden administration was for the waiver. And therefore many people described it as the shot that was heard around the world. And certainly there was a shot that was heard by the American pharmaceutical industry very loudly. It was a decision that was significant, and we discussed, criticized, commented, praised, etc. What is a waiver? A waiver is giving up rights. It's renunciation of rights. But it's not, it's a legal term, but it's not a term in intellectual property law. So I would like to tell you a little bit about intellectual property law, and eventually we'll end up to find out what this waiver would actually entail. So intellectual property law is the basis why medicines are so expensive. And in particular, because patent rights give a patentee or a right holder exclusivity in the market for 20 years, and which means that they can exclude any third party who exploits the invention. So during this period, because the right holder is alone in the market, they can charge monopoly prices or high prices. Technically, it's not a monopoly because certainly in the pandemic in COVID, we saw that there are other providers, but they will charge monopoly-style prices. Why do they do that? In order to recoup the investment into research and development, and they're entitled to make a profit. Now, the pharmaceutical industry will tell us that it costs somewhere between $2 and $3 billion to develop a drug, and it takes 10 years. May or may not be true, but in any event, it takes a long time, and it's very expensive. And so what is the rationale of the system? It's an incentive to innovate. So we have to pay these inventors, developers in some way. We have to create an incentive. So they are here for our pandemic, and they're here for the next pandemic, and they develop the necessary drugs. Supporters of the system say it works really well. The innovation, incentive innovation part works really well. Why do they say that? Because if you recall, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, everyone thought that it would take 3 or 4 years to come up with a vaccine. Well, we had a vaccine in less than a year. And Moderna, which was one of the companies, came out very early, which was a small company who had never had a profit before this. Last year had a profit or had a revenue of $14 billion. So innovation works well, incentive works well. But that's not the end of the story. The problem is that these companies will go and charge high prices throughout the world, whether it's a developed country or not. A word about international patent protection for pharmaceuticals. So patent rights are national. A company needs a patent right granted in a particular country in order to enforce it. If it has no patent right, let's say Moderna, they would have a patent in the United States and nobody else can make the Moderna vaccine. But if Brazil does not have a patent, if Moderna does not register a patent, theoretically, any company can replicate the Moderna vaccine. That doesn't happen. Why? Because the WTO TRIPS agreement requires all member countries to enact patent laws that also cover pharmaceutical inventions. So as a result, we have about 160, well, a few less than 160 countries in the world which require patent laws to cover pharmaceuticals. And so a company like Moderna or any other company, a pharmaceutical company, will register a patent or apply for patent rights in each of these countries. So in other words, no country can manufacture the vaccine legally. No country has the right to do that. So in the meantime, prices are charged. And so let me talk a little bit about pharmaceutical pricing and how it works. So there are two strategies, in particular involving countries with income disparities. The first strategy, which would be more logical, would be to charge high prices in high-income countries and low prices in low-income countries. There's a slight problem with that. It creates something called reference pricing. So let's say a drug dose costs $100 in the United States and $10 in Kenya. Right? The insurers and purchasers in the United States will be hesitant to pay $100 when they know that the drug only costs $10. So therefore, the drug companies prefer a uniform price. And what they're doing is, with lower income countries, they are selling only to the affluent population. So there was a study in South Africa done which showed that 10% of the population were supplied with drugs and the rest was not. And of course, that's not a great model. Right? So it's designed to maximize the profits of the pharmaceutical company, regardless of the effect. And the effect is that 90% of the population cannot afford it, called deadweight loss. And the effect is, of course, counterfeits, because in these countries, people will replicate the vaccines, their safety issues, and so on. So that's where we are. It's not a great situation, and we don't really have a solution. All right. Looking forward. In this situation, what do we do next time? How can we facilitate access to medicine internationally? And I see two main pathways. One is changing the legal framework, talking a bit about the waiver, continuing the waiver discussion, and the compulsory license. Second is the multilateral negotiation conducted by international organizations to achieve adequate distribution. And of course, it would be much facilitated if, as Professor Breer indicated earlier, we had an international convention to take care of that. We don't have that. It's all fragmented. Let's look at the COVID waiver. So what is the effect of the COVID waiver? If the waiver is approved as asked, other companies could legally, worldwide, make the vaccines. Would that really work? So the issue is that especially the more modern ones are very complicated vaccines. So they use the mRNA platform, Moderna and BioNTech, use the mRNA platform. They already have worked for 10 years to develop that platform as a delivery mechanism. And that's why they could do the COVID vaccine so quickly, because the platform existed. But the platform is very complicated. So it's a biologic way of doing it. It requires a lot of research, a lot of development, a lot of scientific, high-level scientists and equipment. Typically, that would not be available in most countries or most companies outside these companies to do that. And the proof is that now there is a move to have this technology expanded expand. So Moderna plans to build an mRNA manufacturing company facility in Kenya. And also the WHO has asked Brazil and Argentina to develop hubs to develop mRNA platforms. So there is a move towards expanding the technology and making it available worldwide. But the other question, in terms of a waiver, is how will the incentive of the pharmaceutical companies be impacted? Because they were here for the pandemic, they made a lot of money. If we take away the patent rights, maybe they will not be here for the next pandemic. Maybe they will not make vaccines, but they will make high blood pressure medicaments, and which are remunerative. So that's an issue. Or alternatively, what they could do is, instead of filing patent applications, in a patent application disclose a fair amount of science underlying the invention. They could keep all that secret under a mechanism called trade secrets. And then science would be impoverished, whereas the pharma companies would still take advantage of the incentive. So that's what happens with the waiver. Now, procedurally, where is the waiver at right now? Right now, it's with the WTO member countries. In order to vote, consensus is required. So if only one country is against the waiver, there is no waiver. All right. So therefore, currently there are negotiations going on because there are many people interested in this waiver actually coming to pass. But the interesting thing is, who's negotiating with whom, right? Normally it would be the global north and the global south. Now it's the EU and the US are negotiating together because they're in opposite positions, and they are trying to come up with a compromise in which certain access will be given to developing lower income countries. So that's where we're at. A text has been developed a couple of weeks ago. Neither party agrees with the text. In between there is India and South Africa, and so that goes on. Eventually they will reach a compromise. That compromise goes in the direction of a legal instrument that's called compulsory license. You may have heard about a compulsory license. It's a use without authorization, and it's authorized by TRIPS Article 31. Here's a little bit about compulsory license. It's an exception to exclusive rights of a patent owner. And a third party can ask or can use a patent without authorization under limited conditions. And so unlike the waiver, which has no conditions, compulsory license places a lot of conditions, including emergency or extreme urgency, showing for non-governmental use. More than the agreement of the right holder, but then of course that's not a compulsory but a voluntary license. It also requires adequate remuneration. No, that would not be at the market level, it would be lower, but still. Most countries have their version of the compulsory license. Brazil has a compulsory license law. But the challenge here is really that it's not a politically favored instrument. Because the country, government, or the court must make a guess or assessment whether there is an emergency, whether there's extreme urgency, whether the conditions limit the conditions so they are in accordance with TRIPS, and TRIPS is very vague. So essentially, any grant of a compulsory license is subject to at least criticism on the international level, if not to legal challenge. On the one side. On the other side, from a demander, someone who would like to have a compulsory license, it's extremely complex procedurally to obtain one. So basically, that's not a great solution. Can the law, Article 31 and 31 bis, be modified? as I said earlier, only one country has to vote against, and it will not happen. But this article has been modified in the past, and maybe under the pressure of COVID it will. And maybe it will also, we need to look at this agreement negotiated by the EU and the US and see what they come up with, what parameters, and maybe those can serve as an inspiration for a format in which this compulsory license can actually be modified. Okay. Last thing, ongoing initiatives. I talked to Professor Pure at lunch. They're very fragmented. Right? We really need a an international convention. So we have COVAX, collaboration of WHO, Gavi, and others. They will provide 20% of the country's population with vaccines. We know that 20% is very little. But there are voluntary waivers. For instance, Moderna agreed not to enforce its patents. I remember what I said before, that people can't make the drug because they don't have the mRNA technology, so I don't know exactly what it means. AstraZeneca sold its drug at cost for at least a year, maybe two. So voluntary waivers exist. The WHO works on various preparedness, readiness, response plans, and so on. Every year it's going to be improved, but I was listening to Professor Pierre this morning, and he doesn't think highly of these efforts as I understand it. More could be done. Obviously, from action and implementation, avoid fragmentation of these efforts, because really there are many efforts. Collectively, they might amount to something, but right now they don't. I will be happy to talk about patent pools, question and answers, if you have an interest, but that is a way of getting down prices of patents of patented medicines by collecting them all in a pool or a collection. But I think the strongest argument in pandemic situations is nobody is safe if all are not safe. And so that's a motivation for the global north to do everything possible so that everyone gets the vaccine. Will work in the pandemic situations, may not work in other cases. All right. And now, I don't want to leave you with a depressing afternoon. So what's the hope in the future? Legal framework we talked about. But really, is technology going to help us? And there's more and more talk about how technology will evolve to lower drug prices. And we're talking, obviously it's a very slow process because the drug manufacturing process is slow. But we are talking about computer modeling of clinical trials. Clinical trials are the expensive part in the drug manufacture. We're talking about AI finding molecules. We're, as a standard matter, drug development, drug discovery and development occurs in silico, that is in digital format. And so the effect of these things is that smaller companies, smaller players will have access to the market. And there are a number of startups in the field. If they have access to the markets, then they will grow. I think that overall, the concentration of the large manufacturers will slowly decrease. Maybe, I don't know. And in fact, Moderna and BioNTech are examples because they came out of very small research companies and they produced something very significant. So that will hopefully lead to a diversification of the market, not just large companies, but smaller players as well, and lead to a solution at least to reduce prices. So I hope in my presentation ended on a somewhat upbeat note, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Bananas, for your very, very interesting presentation. Professor Catherine that is going to make her online presentation. Professor Catherine is going to talk about the ecological ethic and pandemias e ética ecológica.
Many are still being affected by it, including myself and my family. So I thank you for creating this space, relationship, conversation, and I hope to join you as much as possible to my course, international law and colonialism, and to be together with you. Today I will be speaking on academics and ecological ethics, policy violence, black, brown, and vulnerable communities. I will talk a bit about my work in ethics and ecological law, our methodology, the communities that we work, and the arguments that we advance to better question on Earth. Much of this work is through my organization, Environmental Ethics and Law, here in DC, but also through my network, and it's closely related to public health, the International Network of Epidemiology and Policy, a society of public health organizations around the world, governments and non-governmental, that seek to advance ethics in public policy making. Right now, we are working on projects related to this topic, particularly climate change, social justice, including its unequal harm of the poor, the black and brown communities, women and children, and other populations made vulnerable from war, stability. We're also working on these inequities of COVID-19, including its unequal harm on those communities, its unequal mortality rate, its unequal vaccine availability, and its unequal vaccine hesitancy. And lastly, as related to, we are working on a project to declare racism as a global public health crisis. Cities throughout the United States will make global declarations of racism as a public health emergency. They are recognizing undeniable data that discriminatory policies, higher cancer rate, higher mortality rate, to those living next to industry, on poisoned soil, or drinking water. And it's these things whose very bodies have been used in intentional discriminatory harm, whose trust within their political leaders has been broken, who are now facing a pandemic. Black and brown communities are dying more, being harmed more by this pandemic, and all of the injustices that it has uncovered. The pandemic does not create inequity. It shows us equity. Race, after all, is a social construct. So we know that a virus that harms permanently is harming permanently. It is because of choices that make certain people more vulnerable to that harm, or more distrustful to help protect them from that harm. Remember early in the pandemic when we were told this is the time to unite. This is a threat that affects us all. But it does not affect us all. Equally, like all crises. Climate, equal harm. Capitalism, equal harm. War, unequal harm. And even the solution to these harms is not equal. Access to decision-making, access to healthcare, access to the court, our harms, and our solutions not all. And this is why this pandemic, like all crises for us, is an issue of injustice. And so what is the cause of the physical integrity, of this weakened trust, or weakened relational integrity? To begin, I will simply say that pandemic induced policy violence. It is a choice. What communities have access to information, to vaccine? What communities have of harm, exposures and pollution that have degraded their bodies in such a way that they cannot the virus. In the U.S., who has health insurance? Who can go see a doctor if they are sick? Who is afraid to see a doctor they cannot afford it? Environmental injustice is policy violence. It is a choice. Where is the information harm to the political support system? Where are homes being built? Where are industries being built? When a harm is identified, anyone acting on it, is there any accountability to make those decisions that harm? Poverty policy is violence. It is a choice. It is intentional. How is that created? How is that managed? How are loans managed? Are there social safety nets? Is there child care? Does policy support poverty wages or living wages? Are we providing pathways for families to liberate themselves from poverty? Or are we seeing them in poverty, surrounded by unhealthy communities, unhealthy food, and ungoverned government, with a direct line from poverty to prison? These are policy choices. These are intentional acts. And so we must respond intentional arguments against intentional choices for harm and unequal harm. The arguments for my arguments and the vision forward stem from my work at Ethics and methodology. It is a law governance that works around the world. Highlight ethics and action. Share their stories and failures with one another to deal with the global community. Look for commonality and solidarity, and unpack their guiding principles. Legal research, like my work with the Biological Law Association. Ethics is the exploration into right and wrong behavior and responsibility attaches. It is the foundation of the law. It is the argument for justice. If there is a harm, heal that harm. And we make that person or habitat or species whole again. And to those who harm them, we hold them accountable. And we stop that harmful behavior or take action again. This is ethics, equity, justice. And ethics helps identify harm. A safe budget, for example, is nothing more than a statement priority is healthy. For our philosophical methodology, the word the last selected by one of our friends from Brazil. So its heart is in Brazil, meaning to relate, form, and narrative. They are spaces for ethical engagement on real issues of real life. Who are their allies? And who is working against their causes? What motivates them? And how do they address the challenge of corruption, economic poverty, war and violence, discrimination, connection, addiction, loneliness, and loss. And for much of our lives, we listen. We show up. We go where they are. Unless COVID, of course. We work with Jordan and water price, the refugee crisis, the war in Syria, and drought. For the indigenous nomadic people no longer nomadic of the absence of resources in their life and culture. We work with communities in Brazil with facts, racism, murder, where educators are targeted for categorical recyclables in the landfill, in the neighborhood, collective, doing local work of the world, having a job that have integrity, yet disrespected, dehumanized, called dirty. We work with communities in South Africa. Everything we're asking conservation is an act of social upliftment. To help endangered vegetables, they create jobs and help the environment is grow. They wish to build a new park. They go to and hire women because they are the ones to show up. And then with those jobs, entire network of more jobs, the daycare, the kitchen, so that these work. When dealing with systemic harm is needed. They also honestly, courageously face these harm in nature, truth, and reconciliation. We work with communities in South Korea who have their political power stripped away. They try to protect their sacred site, their way of life. They have no voice that affects them. They have been imprisoned, physically attacked for peaceful protest. Yet they have the spirit, the militarization of their village, of the Korean Peninsula, of the South China Sea, of the world, until they have hope for peace. We work with communities in Indiana, human rights project that confronts a decades-long ineffective, uncaring government. A city and a region industry carried our nation world war, now abandoned by that same nation. With its poison water, poison soil, poison people. These black communities who live in sacrifice don't, because their lives are meaningless, or just as not as full as the industry that kills us. This is violence. And we'll be meeting indigenous people in Portugal, people who have died of cancer in the air, and soil and water, from unregulated marble mining. But marble mining is lucrative, they say. Well, for some, but not to these communities. Corruption is this conversation. And after we'll be distorted. Learn about feminist approach to conservation. This called not for breaking down our patriarch that rules us, but the hierarchy that rules us. And how by empowering women, empowering a nation. We will be building policy, preparation for the climate change of the party in Egypt this year. On how feminist principles and working with creators and indigenous approach, where everyone has equal, can help steward their global goals. These are stories of vulnerable, vulnerable by policy. These communities are harmed by their government. Governments who are hostile. It is a story of broken relationships. The broken social contract between the government. And racism, misogyny, patriarchy are the broken relationships. People often fueled by government themselves. And the destruction and of our lives, of nature, our broken relationships with life. What is our cause? If not the cause of life. Justice is not denying history, colonialism, enslavement. Denying history is injustice. Justice is not placing the burden healing on those that harm, demanding more immunities for people who are trying to survive, to put food on their made vulnerable by our system. Yes, they are strong. Stronger than anyone's place of privilege. They are what gives me hope. But they are strong. They have to in order to survive. Ask any mother, any local leader, anyone in a poor community. They are exhausted. And it is inexcusable that we, powerful and the privileged, create this situation that demands we have to be so strong to simply survive. Yes, you should admire the person one against all of the challenges. But we must also find the life who is able to challenges against that person. To begin, first we must that environmental harm itself is an act of inequity, which also explains the lack of political action. Disregard others, that part of our governance system, rooted in colonialism, imperialism, slavery. We as a nation and as a nation create and disregard the vulnerable every day. Government plays harmful in the poor community because it is the path of resistance. These people have no power. The placement of that in the political power in that community and the combination of those two is intentional. And this is why the pandemic, climate, any environmental harm is at a justice issue. Those who are not those who are creating the harm. Those who have no power to stop the harm. Environmental injustice creates and adds harm. It compounds harm. It is the nation that creates the drought, that creates the conflict, that creates the refugees, that then flee to a country, the same country that created the emissions, that then builds to stop them, or denies humanitarian aid, or denies the crisis itself. And it would be a failure any conversation on injustice, on sustainability, without an acknowledgement of the war before us, an attack on life itself. Russian aggression in Ukraine causing great harm, and the impact on the rule of law for generations. The public health network that I'm a part of actually just draft declaration on human rights, public health, war, conflict, forced displacement, occupation, violence. This is all connected. But with the attention on the Geoffrey was also acknowledged related to Palestine, the civil war in Ethiopia, the genocide of the Rohingyas in China, the poison waters against Michigan, the toxic soil in Gary, Indiana. This war, these impacts on life. This is a test for governance. These are existential crises, and they are existential crises by the dreams and human men, men, the power holders, the decision makers, and the women who lift them up. Those that die and toil and act in action and negotiation. The point is that the rule of law separated, negotiated, adopted, incorporated, or choose not to enforce it. If that governance system is process is marked by discrimination, sexism, racism, then its laws will reflect that. Governance is people and power. The powerful people and the principles powerful advance. My work focuses on power imbalances that create policy violence, that continue plantation, they are all connected. And so first we must address power imbalance within a nation, and among nations. This is key to the predation of resources, nature, the land grabs, and the Amazon, the ocean grabs, they know for drought in South China Sea. We see this at local and international negotiations, where the voice of response is more than the voice of billions of others. We see this in the militarization of protection. When indigenous peoples are violent, were killed and raped in the name of nature conservation or fortune conservation. This is law and power for nature protection, used as a tool for harm against those who are other or less than worthy, or simply not human enough to hold human rights. Remember, it is the decision makers within a state that create and laws that govern all aspects of society, within and among nations. What air we breathe, what water we drink, what food we eat, and prisoners have their life taken away. Through the rule of government leaders regulate good and bad behavior. What is considered harm and how much is allowable. Therefore, it is the values and the power that determine our overall well-being and the overall well-being of Mother Earth. Second, address law and policy violence within and among nations. We cannot separate law from policy. I tell this to my students every class. We see how when a political administration changes, the level of harm changes. There may be laws on the books, but an authoritarian they cannot choose to enforce those laws, or they discard the program, or simply disregard their existence. Calls for investment has been filed with the International Criminal Court against Bolsonaro doing this. And they have called it against humanity. If there's a policy for harm, there is policy violence. Poverty is policy violence. The lack of gun regulation, the massive funding of the war is policy violence. The continued zoning of poor minority community policy violence. High rise without proper cooling and deal with the climate policy violence. The absence of universal health care policy violence. Misinformation, the intentional dissemination of untrue in order to remove or stop policy violence. Allowing unlimited dark money into politics is policy violence. Third, we must address corruption. Corruption is causing violence. There's no coincidence that money means campaigns, legislation, policy, and action, nationally and internationally. It can stop laws, stop science, stop information, stop participation in democracy. It allows for subsidy, for knowing behavior. Its purpose force. It pushes economy versus environment mix. It's politicized. Corruption, I believe, is the largest challenge to meaningful action on climate and on all of the environmental and life crises we face. And corruption is closely tied to our last challenge that we must address. If we hope to address for us, rising nationalism, rising authoritarianism, with evidence in the act himself. Dr. King saw the three evils, the three pillars of injustice, as capitalism for creating inequity, racism for creating equality, and militarism for its violence, antithesis of peace. Those who seek power and at the expense of others, those who use violence as a tool to keep that power, and those who grab power by dividing hate, racism, sexism, will never work common good towards peaceability. Let me be clear. If we hope to address our environmental crisis and run into the climate, we must address our governance crisis. We cannot hope to address equities of their harm without addressing inequities of the governance. So how to counter these challenges of power, violence, and discrimination? But it's now a foundational principle of justice, the rule of law, ecological governance. It should be highlighted in any argument, equitable environmental justice. First and foremost, the duty not to harm. And this includes fighting of discrimination, sexism, and racism. Discrimination, harm. And according to the Netherlands, corporations have human rights obligations. And with the duty not to harm is responsibility and accountability to hold those who harm to account, even for historic harm, which we see always at the time of negotiation. But never acted upon because the powerful will not allow it. They, after all, seem powerful because of their emission and exploitation. There's also the duty to protect. That is the foundation contract between a nation and people. Understanding that cannot protect your citizens if you act in a way that harms others outside your borders. In other words, we must account for their exteriality of environmental harm, as opposed to the state of denying accountability for those harms. Or refusing jurisdiction to even hear them before the court. State sovereignty is not a shield that allows nations to harm. Within the duty to understand that there is a vulnerable. For if the most vulnerable are protected, all are protected. This recognition is also an act of accountability. And the vulnerable were made vulnerable by inequitable, unjust laws and policies. And this would include generation. Why should they take the burden of the harm that this generation created? That is not equitable, that is not just. And when nations protect, they also have to recognize non-regression. That when they reach a certain level of protection, it is not backwards. This would be a direct counter hostile administration and provide stability in our government system. The precautionary principle is also foundational to protect and a binding treaty obligation of the U.S. framework climate change, to which nearly all nations are a party. It demands that government act in the face of uncertainty. And so if it tries to deflect, stop act due to the causes of climate change, remind them that they are bound to act in the science and the system. And within this idea of responsibility, another UN obligation, the common responsibility principle. This is the definition of the UN equity. Therefore, is not the same as international law. It is a treaty obligation. It demands negotiating. It demands accountability of historic harm. And part of measure responsibility is also looking at corporations, and they knew that their actions were to the harm. Like with the tobacco case, with COVID, corporations and governments are informing the public on the causes and harm. They are knowingly causing harm, which there is a greater responsibility for that harm. The methodology is not particular to climate nor COVID, but it is particular to authoritarianism. Equity also demands the approach endemic crisis with principle interconnectedness and interdependence. For us, when we talk about Ubuntu. Ubuntu is an ethical and legal for Southern Africa. It is a world, a way of life, a methodology to address the harm, to truth and reconciliation. Ubuntu means I am because you are. My identity is wrapped up in your identity. And we have extended that to nature. My nature is, as well as the relationship state, a relational sovereignty. A state is because of other states. Our relations guide our action, and there are also a building of solidarity. Another ethical principle at the root of justice. Connected to our solidarity, our motivation is also the principle of love and the for love. Biophilia, the love of living things. Local philia, a love of our places. Sociophilia, the love of one another. And of course, ecophilia, little. How can we love others without love ourselves? One of my favorite philosophers, in particular, why love matters for justice. There are also Democrats that are fundamental to the idea of practice of justice. And it counter injustice, truth, face of disinformation, acting in good faith and for the common good, in the face of corrupt money and hyper individuals. Access to information, transparency, justice, and support for participatory rights. Equality before the law to directly combat corruption. Having a voice making an elected leader, particularly protecting and harmful. The recognition of human rights, political, and the enforcement against violations of those rights. Human rights to the healthy environment, generations, our human rights to life. These principles are the foundation of law and system. In other words, they already under our understanding of law and justice required nation. We have not been brought to this because of the lack of ethical guidance, but because of the lack of leaders who lead us. And so now, how to move forward? In my closing. We identify the harm. We identify models and methods and examples of justice. So many of these models and methods are held by the very we have harmed. We have tried to erase. We have tried to bury. It is in those communities, their language, their experience, their hopes, their history, their ways of coping with a hostile environment that can carry us forward. But to even get to that point where we learn, there must be massive efforts at building, at truth and reconciliation, and certainly denial as we are being left. The UN and other international bodies also have looked within to acknowledge that what they are doing is not working. For example, advancing sustainable goals. A development model of sustainability. I argue that was a done model. Peace, after all, is not without justice. They must strengthen their structures, good governance, how they effective. And nations are the same. Nations must recognize that what they are doing is not working, strengthen their structure with governance. Those to the effective community ignore the disregarded people. Those to those that remain vulnerable, harmful economic and governance in power, and will explicitly ways power them and foster their capabilities. After all, how can we expect the solution to our crises comes from the ones who create, sustain them. For me, the strongest evidence for ethical action for sustainability would be to strengthen their anti-corruption principles. Stop the money that stops the progress. Place checks on executive action. Enforce transparency, information report. Expand the criminalization of certain harms. When I was asked in Chile, what should they include in their constitution that would best help climate change? My answer was not more laws or exploration or ocean. A hostile leader or government simply ignores laws. No. We must strengthen the just rules that would prevent hostile leaders or government from taking power using common good. And one that is able to account if they act for power. Include ethical engagement for the most important issues that we face. From the pandemic, from militarism, the climate are created existential crises. Yet these are inevitably shared and equity created crises. Ultimately, we cannot turn away the face of harm. We cannot turn away the face of such injustice. We must intentionally counteract acts of justice and face the harm before us. Unequal harms are created. Unequal harms are felt. Our solution cannot be race blind, sex blind, when the cause are not. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Geoffrey, for your presentation. It was a pleasure hearing you. I would like to thank all the professors for the presentation today, but we still have time to open for some questions, so the debate. So if anyone has questions, se alguém tiver perguntas da plateia para fazer para os professores, a gente tem alguns minutos para o debate. Eu tenho uma primeira pergunta. I have a question to Professor Garver. Professor, so hearing you, and it was a very interesting presentation. So considering that we are living an environmental crisis or ecological crisis, and we are living a food crisis too, and I remember when I read Kafka that said that environmental crisis is a crisis of consciousness. So we have to, as you said, we have to change our food culture. I think in order to try some change in this monoculture that we have stable today. And how do you think we can change this crisis of consciousness, considering the food culture that we have? As you said, that we as consumers are used to. So we are used to what we receive as a final product. So how can we change that, and what role could law play in this culture change?
I should use the Zoom. Oh, it's not necessary.
Oh, yes.
Well,
when
in developing a vision for ecological law,
the
challenge is to both have a long-term vision where we've achieved sort of, as I framed it, a system of laws built around a shared goal of a mutually enhancing human-Earth relationship, and that's a goal that can mean different things in different places. I mean that. So starting today, we have to start with the system we have. I try to look at examples where local places are learning ways to thrive, or there are alternatives to these monocultural type systems. In terms of the ways of organizing enterprises, cooperatives that are not driven by shareholder profit and obligations that shareholders are running. I do community-supported agriculture. I know the farmers who grow my food in the summer. I ride my bike there. I make it part of my life. I try to denormalize the idea that my food comes in little packages wrapped in plastic in a supermarket as much as I can. How do you normalize this across a world that is bombarded with advertisements that adds a lot of money and power keeping those things normal? I don't really. It's hard to say. In a democratic society, the people who find those things normal are also going to pick our leaders. And look at some of the leaders we've had in some very big, highly populated countries. I won't say it. Maybe here, maybe the United States. In my work, in order to deal with this, I was talking to Professor Pierre about this. I developed these leverage points for change with the work of Donna LaMeadows, where some things can be done more immediately and they're more superficial. Some things have to be done in a more fundamental way. You're trying to change the whole functioning rules in law, constitutions in a way that facilitate more ecological approaches. Some of those changes are going to take decades, maybe more, if we're going to succeed in doing them. Other things we can start today. So my work was to try and sort out how do we find the priorities and the things, the strategies that we can really emphasize today, while always keeping the long view out ahead of us as a beacon that we're striving to work towards. So it's really a framework. It's denormalizing, and unfortunately, I think allies in this are the fact that certain crises are becoming more evident. This week in Montreal, it's going to be warmer than it is in Florianopolis by a long shot. It's projected to be 31 degrees in Montreal on Friday. That's not usual for the 13th of May. Okay, and these things are happening more and more. The pandemic crisis, the climate crisis, demands urgent attention. This message is getting some airplay along the TikTok, the TikTok influencers trying to get you to buy a different outfit every day, and the Black Fridays. I have hope that these messages will come through in time. And by the way, I'll end with this. It's your generation. It's you who have more to live in this world than I do now, having turned 60, that I have the most faith in. You are seeing these crises in a way I didn't see when I was your age. You are really the generation that is going to lead
towards in new directions, because it's going to have to happen if we're going to avoid catastrophe. That's a long answer.
Thank you very much.
Technology. Thank you very much, Professor. Alguém gostaria de fazer perguntas? Vou levar perguntas. Sorry.
I have a question for Mr. Dan. It's regarding the patent system that has been built in a way that does not include fully not all countries are implemented the same way. Not every country can participate in the same way. The pharmaceutical industry is profiting a lot and is also using a lot of technology that's code for example. So how to find a balance between this an ecosystem and the patent system that material rules and still guarantee that innovation development enhanced.
Can you hear me on the system? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. By the way, thank you so much for our technological support. Things are very complex, as they see, and they function impeccably. So that's great. Thank you for your question. And it's a great question because this is the core. I mean, this is the core access to medicine. But it's not just in the medicine area. It's most acute, obviously, because it's a humanitarian right. It's in every type of product. The patent system is built in this way. So as I explained, there are. This patent system talks about incentive and innovation. So in order to incent, we want innovation, right? So as a society, theoretically we have to pay. The question is, how is this effort financed, right? If it's privately financed by, let's say, the pharmaceutical company, then obviously we run into this problem where the price will be high. Hypothetically, it could be financed by governments. And governments then would not, I mean, then we would exercise a price structure which is reasonable and more equitable. So that's for the price, let's say, the general principle mechanism. But if we think back, what is a patent system? Patent system is something that's meant to produce innovation for who? For society, right? And if we think that way, then the goal is to provide society, respective countries, respective lower income countries, with the products of innovation. And I think that would be an approach to arguing that basically the patent system as it is doesn't serve society. So that's idealistic. Also, but from the practical standpoint, we have to see that there are pharmaceutical companies who do a job right now because we do have vaccines. How politically can we maneuver this in order for them not to continue to exercise influence on the legislatures then get elected and make laws and so on. So it's a vicious circle. And I think one thing, sadly enough, a pandemic will do a lot. Injustice will do a lot. And I think advocacy just advocating that this patent system is meant to help society. But I think we have some work ahead of us. I don't know if that answers your question. Sure.
Close your microphone and
Mais perguntas?
Thank you for your line and while you're thinking about the problems from international pharmaceuticals, you say that for business solution, and I wanted to ask you talk a little more about that. I kind of didn't get why they were this way.
Gladly. So the compulsory license mechanism, which is in TRIPS, has been fought, is probably the most fought over provision in TRIPS. And it has quite a history because countries started imposing compulsory licenses under TRIPS or started enacting laws under TRIPS. Then they were criticized publicly, they were ostracized, they were sued, and so on. Indonesia, Malaysia, India had a very famous case where they actually granted the compulsory license at some point. And so the press about that was so incredibly negative, the global press. Presumably that's at the instance of right holders, but as a legal matter, it's the TRIPS provision is very vague, right? So if a country enacts a law, how precisely does that country enact the law to comply with the TRIPS agreement? So anything they do, they might be subject to criticism. And so that's why countries are relatively, or not countries, potential applicants for compulsory licenses are generally hesitant to ask for it because the country at the country level can be criticized, the court can be criticized, and so on. So the other thing is, if you look at the Brazilian compulsory license law, it is the new law is now better, is a little bit easier, but it is very, very complicated because step one, you have to ask the right owner for permission, right? For a voluntary license, right? So that's a step in negotiation. Typically, they will not give you a voluntary license. If you have that, then you can go on and ask a court to give you a compulsory license. Will the court in the respective country give you a compulsory license? Question mark. Under what circumstances? Question mark. And ultimately, as an applicant for a compulsory license, your transaction costs are so big that ultimately you don't get much out of it. I've learned.
My question, I think, is also so the professor, when it is about patent convention.
I'm sorry, about the patent pools, yeah.
You think that they in some way go back to balance, and the second one about ongoing negotiations and necessary you think that what do you think about this? Isn't too late pandemic in the sense that passive mention a significant positive more feels like we are going to be over the pandemic, so we can still get changes right now, which you're asking, which is linked to this debate.
Thank you very much for the question. So in terms of patent pools, there is some history about that. The World Health Organization organized a medicine patent pool at some point. The mechanism is such that there are voluntary contributions or contributions against cost, reduced cost into a pool. And then basically an interested party can have a one-stop shop, license all the patents that they need out of the pool. In terms of, I'm not entirely sure about the COVID vaccine, because it seems to me that there are not multiple component patents, multi-component medication. It's more suitable in types of medications where you have many components and you can license all together in a single procedure, which reduces the cost. So that can work. It can work if it's well administered. The one with the World Health Organization, it was reasonably well administered. It had reasonable success. I think based on that we can build further patent pools. So they're very common in the electronic industry, the entertainment industry, and so on. So, and that's where you have many patents which go, let's say, into a phone, a communication device, and so on. But they're suitable in the medical field too, and I think they can be expanded. It's an area that's being studied, and there's some history to that. So that's the question. The other question is it too late for COVID? Yeah, it's too late for COVID, because by the time these negotiations end, hopefully we're going to be done with this. But there's a precedential value to that. Because if the European Union and the United States, including South Africa and Brazil and India and so on, agree on some formulation, that will be a pathway, hopefully will be a pathway for the future, because this is the one occasion where everyone sat at the table and discussed. So therefore, with any luck, that result will then be taken over in the TRIPS agreement. But here I'm speculating. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Professor Dan and Professor Garver very, very much for your presentations and for sharing all the knowledge with us today. We appreciate it a lot.
Gostaria muito de agradecer a vocês que tivemos hoje. Foi muito interessante, muita valia. E amanhã recomeçaremos essas conferências às 9
Professor, take out
Eu gostaria de dar uma notícia. Nós tivemos algum imprevisto justamente ao Covid. Nosso conferencista, o senhor Fabrício Menegon de vir. Nós então incluímos dois outros cientistas daqui da USP para falar sobre a questão das pandemias. Nós então tivemos que fazer de horário, foi convidado convidados de última hora, e a gentileza de aceitar, e eles poderão estar presentes às 15 horas amanhã. Então, amanhã às 15 horas, nós teremos a professora Josimar e o professor desculpem, mas isso nós saímos correndo. Nós temos muitos grandes especialistas aqui e infelizmente foi difícil trazê-los de última hora, mas tivemos essa aceitação tanto da professora Josimari como também do professor Lúcio Botelho. O professor Lúcio Botelho é epidemiologista e a professora Josimária da Saúde Pública. Também nos falará sobre políticas públicas e pandemia. Então, penso que no final teremos então uma contribuição bastante importante. Just a small une observation pour cette pandémie, on aura à 15 heures deux professeurs, un épidémiologiste et un professeur de la santé publique. On va parler sur les pandémies l'autre parlera sur la politique publique et l'exemple des communs. Bon, c'est ça, c'est une petite modification et je vous remercie à tous et je vous souhaite une bonne continuation.
Eu acho que eu só sei umas duas para trás.
Da professora lá do CFH, como que é?
Sim. Antes dessa.
Antes dessa. Ou antes de sei lá. A minha primeira matrícula, tenho 3 de graduação. As duas são terminadas, tá? Depois eu falo quais são. Mas a minha primeira matrícula é 92 anos. Duas outras matrículas que eu terminei, eu sou graduado nelas. Agronomia já pequeno. Não temos as coisas. Não. Mas a minha primeira matrícula